Hello, everybody. Another week, another episode of What's Cooking. Today we have Jason that is going to introduce himself in a few seconds. So again, ENZYME at Work. What is the purpose of ENZYME at Work? Is to bring knowledgeable people to share with us about the topic on collaboration, science, lab to market, circular economy, so all entrepreneurship key. And because there's a lot of things cooking, a lot of things moving, it's complex. So I decided to launch this so that we get a chance to learn from the people that are on the front line. So without further ado, Jason, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Sébastien. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Sébastien said, my name is Jason Papadopoulos. I'm a sustainability expert. I work as a freelancer or interim for different organizations, helping them to implement sustainability strategies, specific components or whole strategies, and then implement those.
Very good. Thank you. So the topic of today, so we see a lot of people with sustainability manager. We hear a lot of things about sustainability management in the corporate world. And what I wanted to do today with Jason is to say, okay, what does it take for a sustainability manager inside the corporate world to deliver? What does it mean? I mean, what are you supposed to do? What is the scope? What is the strategy? What is the action plan? What are we talking about? What is this person, let's say, accountability for? So let's go into the topic of today. So about the topic you just mentioned. So what's cooking now? I mean, I see a lot of more seriousness around sustainability manager. People are being much more serious than they may be in the past. I see now they have to deliver. What's cooking now?
Yes, you're right. So things have been picking up rather rapidly the last few years. There's multiple convergent pulls and pushes for that to happen. So obviously, one of the things that everybody knows about is the COP from the Paris Agreement for carbon reductions, greenhouse gas reductions that happened several years ago. The European Union has been making big pushes in Europe, probably the most ambitious, most aggressive ones in the world. So there's the so-called EU Green Deal. And if you have a look at that, there's an enormous amount of directives, regulations, recommendations about a whole set of different activities that organizations need to do. Most of them are for very large organizations, traded organizations on the stock exchange, or large organizations above a certain revenue or above a certain number of employees, around 250. And then this has a trickle-on effect on everybody in their supply chain and their customers also. So it's quite complex and it's quite diverse. And every few weeks or every few months, there's something new coming out. It takes them a long time to work through this. Quite a detailed process. It's interesting to look at that. But yeah, just to keep it short, let's say there's a whole bunch of regulations there that are coming out. They're constantly coming out the last few years, and then more and more companies are trying to catch up. There's some pioneers, let's say, some leaders ahead of the game, and then there's others that are playing catch up. So right now it's kind of the point where you can't be waiting to catch up. You need to jump on board. One of the biggest regulations that came out is the so-called CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and that requires organizations over a certain size to report everything they're doing. Non-financial reporting, that is everything they're doing, human rights, environmental sustainability, all sorts of areas. We don't have too much time to get into that, but so that's one major bit that's pushing for all organizations that are based in the EU, but also organizations that have a footprint in the EU. So let's say big companies like Apple or Google that have a significant footprint in the EU. Well, they also need to abide by those regulations. So it makes it quite interesting on a global scale. So the EU is having an impact there. The other thing that is worth noting, a few years ago, the CEO of BlackRock, which is often quoted as being the biggest fund manager in the world, that essentially sits on the board of some of the, I would say, 60 to 70%, conservatively speaking, of the Fortune 1000 companies. They said that they would not support any board members getting re-elected if their organization is not doing an ESG, another key term, environmental social governance reporting. And you see all these different things are putting a lot of pressure. Then you have in all different countries different regulations, some of them more aggressive, some of them less, some in areas like plastic waste, others in areas like reporting what you're doing, others about climate change, biodiversity. So a lot of buzzwords, but yeah, just to sum up, I don't want to take too much time with that, but we can obviously delve into details.
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, I get that there is kind of this landscape. The landscape, let's say, now is becoming, there's a landscape with regulation coming into play now as we speak. We have this threshold 250. For me, it's like SME standpoint, 250. This is from SME standpoint. We have European regulation. We have domestic regulation. If you can just dig into, just because this is important in terms of timing, are we talking about regulation for which the company have to comply now?
Yes.
Or are we talking about things that are in, because I see a couple of things for 2025, 2030, what? Yes. How is it about the timing?
The horizon varies. So for some things, it goes as far out as 2050. But the most pressing things, and that's why I said there's no more time to beat around the bush, by 2025, they all need to report about at least the CSRD, this corporate social responsibility directive. So they need to report about what they're actually doing by 2025 for 2024 figures already. And then there's some exceptions. They're going into 2026. There's other things like the EU taxonomy that already took place. So they had to report already. And they're all kind of in steps. So there's multiple requirements. The idea of the EU is not just to burden people with reporting, but the idea is you start off by making an assessment of where are we? Where are we as an organization? What are we doing? And then what do we want to do, right? And that's the whole idea of this. So they've put all these targets so that people can assess where they're at right now for all this big amount of information, whether it be your carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, whether it be your waste production, whether it be your circular economy activities, what have you.
And does it mean that
quite specific? Sorry.
So does it mean that, let's say, based on what you say, we are already getting into the role of the sustainability manager? Is the sustainability manager in charge of doing this assessment?
Yes.
For his companies?
Exactly. So since we're talking about larger companies, the complexity is much bigger. So they need a whole team of people to work. Sometimes they need a whole team of people plus external organizations or consultants like myself that focus on specific areas and do certain things. Like you have a life cycle analysis, that's quite a detailed activity. You have a whole sort of ecosystem of different tools to help people. You have to think about what kind of tools will you use to gather and store that data. Can you actually integrate that into your existing IT systems like an ERP system? So sustainability managers, again, it depends on the company. The more pioneering companies or the more early starters, they already have sustainability team, a sustainability manager, and they're already out there. They've already been publishing CSR reports or ESG reports, getting these audited by audit organizations and make sure that these are reliable and accurate. And what they need to do is they need to keep the eye on the ball as far as what is it regulation wise that's coming out, what is it intrinsically that we want to do as an organization? Where do we want to be strategically 5, 10, 20 years in the future? Because you need to make serious capital investments to, for example, switch to renewable energy. Yeah? That's not something you do like that. You need to think about tons of carbon emissions, let's say, or greenhouse gas emissions that you need to decide what you want to do with them, because there are targets to reducing those, obviously. You want to decide, okay, how much do we want to take advantage of funding from the state, for example, for solar panels or wind generation or thermal energy, what have you. So these are all things that they need to keep all their eyes and ears open and actively get information, what's coming in as far as subsidies, what's coming in as regulation. What do our investors want to know on the ESG side? They want to know certain things. They want to know what's the risk in investing in my company. So these are all things that they're to various degrees all doing. No company is the same to any other company. So it's really hard to compare one company to the other. And everybody really needs to tune into what's their business. Yeah. So some qualities that a sustainability manager I think should have or needs to have is, at first, needs to be a good business analyst, needs to understand what's the business doing, needs to have an idea of business process design and how the processes in the organization function and what's the organizational hierarchy, all the different stakeholders, which jumps into something called organizational change management. So you want to be able to understand how, after you know who the stakeholders are, you want to know, okay, how are we going to help these different stakeholders to communicate with each other, because they need to make systemic changes. They need to make changes that are not just for one division or another division. They need to plug in with each other, and they need to also consider collaborating across industries, across different companies, maybe collaborate with their suppliers, collaborate with their customers. So this is quite another key word that I bring in. They need to be a systems thinker. They need to think about systems. And it's not just about solving problems in the old way of, let me just sit down on my desk and start crunching some numbers and I'm going to pump out a report and I'm all done. No, it's not so easy. So sustainability manager is more of a kind of a leadership, coordinating, facilitating, moderating role that's trying to interact with all the different stakeholders within the organization, bring them together, a bit like a networker, and connect outside of the organization to see what are others doing outside the organization, try and bring those in. There's a lot of, for example, associations, industry associations or cross-industry associations that help to bring in companies together, or organizations or communities, municipalities and so on together, so that they can manage to do things at a much greater scale that they couldn't either afford to or have the capacity to do on their own. And then you scale at a much higher level. So at the end of the day, you cannot be, if you're managing sustainability in an organization, it's not about being a specialist in some kind of specific scientific area, let's say, but it's more about being a people person, being kind of astute to what's happening out there in general in the industry, and what's happening in your organization, and how can you pull the different people together, and how can you facilitate the process for them, because ultimately everything needs to be embedded in the business processes, and not expect somebody called a sustainability team member to do everything. They're not going to make the change. They're just going to facilitate or moderate that change. And they need to make sure that that change gets applied into the existing business processes, so that at the end, we go beyond the regulation and the pressure, whether it be risk or investor pressure or customer demands or supplier needs and demands, but to go into a kind of a, okay, what do we want to achieve? Do we want to be a pioneer in sustainability? Do we want to have some kind of trend setting? Do we want to develop new products or services that are taking advantage of this before somebody else? Do we
or just do you want to, maybe you just want to be compliant with the law? Maybe you just want to be compliant.
So that's very feasible, right? So a lot of companies are doing that or just focusing on that. Some are not even started. So I would recommend to them, if they're listening, to get started, because it's quite a lot of work.
What are the risk? You said you better start it.
Yes.
What are the risk?
Well, the risk is that you might get fines. So you might get fined from a specific regulatory or authority. Might be that if you're a traded company and you've got external investors, like I mentioned, BlackRock, if you're a traded company, they might not support what you're doing anymore, because they've made it quite clear you need to at least do your reporting. Yeah, and then further on, they're probably going to have higher demands. But they want to make sure you're not a risk factor. And if you're not doing this, you are a risk factor, because you don't have a transparency about what may impact you. If there's climate change, if there's biodiversity, let's say you're in agriculture or food production, well, you're impacted by what happens both from climate and biodiversity changes on this planet. What happens about human rights changes or laws in different areas that would impact you in the media, for example, right? So there's all sorts of factors, and these are all risks. So you can't be missing the boat. You need to be in the boat, and you need to be steering that. And I would argue it doesn't make sense to invest so much money and effort just to comply, just to do compliance and do paperwork and submit reports that you're not acting on, because you're investing time and money. I would much prefer that you invest money and time and have some kind of business benefit from that. If you're a business or if you're a municipality, have a return on that investment. What do we want to achieve? Where do we want to be? Do we want to target clients that are interested in sustainable products? Do we want to target clients that are not in sustainable area? So what is the future for that? Is the future in sustainability or it's not? So you have to decide. Otherwise, others will jump ahead of you if they haven't already.
I like that. It's somehow we're already touching, let's say, the last point of this podcast, but I like the fact that somehow the regulation are kind of reshuffling the whole game in some ways. Absolutely. So you can maybe, by playing it right, like you just mentioned, you can maybe come up out of it with a better competitive position.
Absolutely, yes. And you need to be a constant look at what your competitors are doing, not just the regulators, but what are the competitors doing? So where are they? What are they doing? Because we've seen that a lot with a lot of new startups in the last 20 years, right? 20 to 40 years, I would say. We've seen so many companies from one day to the next, just to them, it appears like one day to the next, they've just disappeared. Big companies like, I'm thinking of Kodak right now, right? Or Xerox had a difficult time, right? So Kodak is still there as a brand and a company, but it disappeared off the face of the earth for a long time because they weren't ready for the digital space. So you can't afford not to be ahead of the game, right? So that's a critical factor to think about.
That's a strong statement. I mean, there's a lot of companies that have been there. You know, they are maintaining some kind of the minimum growth they need. So they need to change their mindset. You know, when I was preparing a little bit this podcast today, I was reading the Handelsblatt. I don't know if people see it, but I mean, for the non-German people here, Handelsblatt is like the economic newspaper of Germany, and it's the first on the page. And you speak German better than me, Jason. But that's basically the CEO of Volkswagen that is in trouble because they need to fulfill the CO2 emission in 1.5 years from now.
So that's another perfect example, right, of what we were just saying. So I was just reading earlier today. At the moment, I don't know if it's just me getting a lot of push notifications about BYD, this e-vehicle manufacturer from China, and everybody's worried they're going to take over Europe and the US and so on. And what's happening with European automobile manufacturers? Have they missed the ball? And that's going back to the previous point, right? Have they missed the ball? Did they jump on too late? Have they missed a technological advantage? Has BYD beat them to that, or Tesla, or who have you?
Yeah, correct. Cool. We are right on time, Jason. I know it's short. I know there's lots of things to be said. I know we could have, let's say, 10 times Jason to talk about this, but it's also why I'm doing this on purpose, 20 minutes to capture the essence. And I think the message is rather clear from Jason today. So again, if the people that are going to listen to this podcast, if they want to know more, reach out to Jason. He knows what he's talking about, as you can hear today. Jason, thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for preparing this podcast. Thank you for being clear in a very short time. You did it great. So thank you again, Jason, for that.
Thanks, Sébastien. Very nice format. Thanks a lot for having me, and it's a pleasure.
Okay, cool. See you, everybody. Another week, another podcast. So see you next week. And again, thank you for your time.
Take care. Bye-bye.